Hello, everyone. My name is Alan, and it's that time yet again. Let's talk metal. For tonight's episode, I thought I would go through a compilation album in particular and kind of pick it apart because I think it's a very good compilation for folks who want to get into new wave of British heavy metal, or at least figure out more about it. And there are some people who know this style inside and out and already, well invested in it. There's not going to be any new information in this video for those folks. They'll probably know this album and all the tracks and all the bands featured on it. But for other folks, younger fans or fans who just never have really delved into that corner of the heavy metal underground, a question or a comment that I see a lot is that there's just so many bands that fall under this new wave of British heavy metal umbrella. And I can see where it would be very difficult for someone to figure out, where do I start? There's hundreds upon hundreds of bands. How do you start figuring out what you're going to like, what you might not like? It's also worth noting there's more variation among these bands in terms of their musical style than people sometimes give credit for. There is a new wave of British heavy metal sound that a lot of bands kind of gravitated towards, but still, you have a lot of outliers that are farther away from that sound. Bands that went more doomy, bands that went faster, speedier, thrashier, bluesier, bands that went more for a biker or boogie kind of vibe. There's a lot of directions you can go in. So if you just randomly pick a couple of things to check out online, you might just inadvertently hit some duds. You might hit a couple that are in styles you don't like. And let's be honest, a lot of us aren't going to invest a ton of time into checking something out. We're going to give it a cursory listen. But after a few songs, if we're not into it, we might very well move on to something else. We're not going to sit there and sample 100 different new wave of British heavy metal bands to see what we think of the genre. We're going to sample a handful and probably draw a conclusion based on that. So this video is for those folks who are looking for an entry ramp. How do we get into this style or figure out if it's right for us? Well, the best way to do this, in my opinion, is picking up a compilation album, because that's going to give you exposure to a bunch of bands in one place, and a lot of the compilation albums are relatively affordable. I want to recommend one in particular, and I admit I'm biased because this album was my introduction to the new wave of British heavy metal, but I honestly do think it's a very good starting point for anyone who wants to learn about the genre. I've talked about this album, here and there before, but yeah, tonight we're going to pick it apart in a bit more detail. The album in question is this. It's New Wave of British Heavy Metal 79 Revisited. It's a double album. This is the CD pressing. It comes in one of those old-fashioned double CD cases. It's available in vinyl. It was also available on cassette. I originally had a cassette copy of it. Eventually, the cassette copy went its way, and I got a CD version instead. This is what I still have. It comes with a booklet with a lot of information in it, and there's several reasons I think this is the compilation for people to start with if they really just don't have much of a feel at all for what new wave of British heavy metal entails. One thing right away is that it's a very long compilation. The cassette version that I had included 24 songs, so it's almost like a double-length cassette tape at that point. The CD has even more tracks. You have 24 tracks from the cassette, and you have 6 bonus tracks as well. So it's not just 1 or 2 extra songs, but 6, bringing the total to 30. So right away, you're getting a big cross-section of bands. Among the 30 tracks on here, there's 29 different bands featured. One band did get 2 songs for reasons that we'll touch on in a little bit. Other reasons this one is a pretty good place to start with. It does have a very good set of liner notes. It's a very clean layout to the booklet, where for each track, it gives you the essential rundown, but it also tells you where the song was from. And they pulled tracks from a lot of different places. Some are from singles, some are from original compilations back in the day, some are from full albums. There were 1 or 2 that were unreleased previously. They were BBC recordings that hadn't been put out when this thing was originally issued around 1990, 1991. So you get a lot of info packed in here as well, but it's an easy to digest format. Other reasons this is a good one to start off with. It was released on Metal Blade. This was kind of a labor of love between Lars Ulrich and Brian Slagle, both huge fans of new wave of British heavy metal. They had originally intended for it to come out at the 10-year anniversary. They wanted it to come out in 1989, 10 years after the explosion began in 1979. But logistics came up, it didn't quite make it. And so it was released a little bit after that, which doesn't really affect anything. But being on Metal Blade, it's always been a relatively easy one to track down. The price is a little higher these days. I looked on Discogs right before starting this. And it looks like for a lot of, CD or vinyl copies, CDs, I'm seeing in like, the $25, $30 range, you can get decent copies. The vinyls may be a little more expensive than that. But if you compare that to what you're paying for CDs and vinyls most of the time anyway, that's not an outrageous price. Again, this is essentially 2 full albums of material that, unless you're just going to listen to it song by song online, is a little hard to come by. So even with the price having gone up a bit over time, I think it's still a pretty good buy if you're really serious about wanting to check out new wave of British heavy metal. So it's got a lot of stuff on it, comes with a lot of info, and the price is not outrageous. No, it's not cheap, but it's also, it's not selling for, hundreds and hundreds of dollars or anything crazy like that either. Last big reason that I think this is a great starting place for folks is that the track list is very varied. They feature some very sort of what you'd call common bands that most people are going to pick up on very early when they explore a new wave of British heavy metal. But they also include some deeper cuts from bands that were very obscure and didn't make a lot of waves back in the day. They also feature a lot of different styles of music. All of these bands are not just working in the same mold musically. As I mentioned before, there's a lot of variation in the sounds that different bands tried from this era, and you get a good cross-section of that. So let's walk through the track list, see what you get and what's featured here. I'm just going to read these out of the booklet because the print's a little bigger. It's a little easier to read that way. All right, disc 1, you start off right away with Diamond Heads. It's Electric. This is from the Lightning to the Nations recording sessions. Diamond Head was a hugely influential band on Lars and Metallica. Probably if there was no Diamond Head, there never would have been a Metallica. This was a band that Lars was able to hook up with, tour around in Europe and the UK some with, and kind of, start learning the ropes. And he came back, to California much more serious and focused about getting his own band up and running. Diamond Head, it's the perfect band to start this compilation with because they're legendary in new wave of British heavy metal circles. They had one of the best, if not the best, vocalist on the entire scene in Sean Harris. And it's an energetic track. It's got a thick sound. It right away shows you that this isn't just a bunch of bands playing sort of, leftover 70s metal or hard rock riffs, that it has a very distinct sound to it here in the early 80s. So, very good track to lead off with. Track number 2 is Eye of the Storm by Sweet Savage. This is a great follow-up track. I like this track at slot number 2 because Sweet Savage is one of the most aggressive bands in the new wave of British heavy metal style. This is proto-speed and thrash metal right here. And a complaint that you often hear from folks, or a concern that you hear, is that new wave of British heavy metal always sounds a little too lightweight, a little too plain, and it's not heavy enough. And I do get that for folks that, grew up on thrash or death or black metal. Yes, this stuff does not compare to those styles of music. But Sweet Savage can hold their own against any kind of power speed band that you'd want to line it up against. So having this right at the front of the compilation really opens your eyes right away so that you can see some of these bands really know how to kick ass and kick ass very hard. It's a great track, very energetic, very forceful. And yes, it's setting the tone right away that this is probably not going to meet some people's expectations. It's going to open their eyes to the fact that these bands are a lot heavier, some of them are, than what they've always had the stereotype of being too, not heavy. All right, after that, you have Saxon with Motorcycle Man. Very good track by Saxon. Saxon's another big name band, one of the largest from the new wave of British heavy metal. And as such, it's a band that should be featured on a compilation like this. When you're first getting your feet wet, you do want to check out some of the big acts. Those are going to be the reference points that people are going to sort of assume that you know, and that other bands are going to get compared to. This band sounds like Saxon. This band doesn't sound like Saxon. So yes, you want to know those guidepost bands, and Saxon's a big one for having that classic traditional new wave of British heavy metal sound to it. So getting an introduction to Saxon, essential, they're included right here. All right, track 4, you have White Spirit with Cheetah. This is an interesting inclusion. It's the band that featured Yannick Gers long before Iron Maiden came a-calling. And the deal with this one is that this does have a little bit more of a 70s throwback sound to it. I like the song quite a bit, but overall, White Spirit was a band that was probably going for a bit more of like a Deep Purple Mark II vibe on a lot of their tracks. It's not my favorite band. I do like this one song quite a bit. Some of their other tracks, they do seem a little too stuck in the 70s for my tastes personally. But including them here, again, shows you that facet that there were new wave British heavy metal bands that were still wearing their influences on their sleeve pretty blatantly, and Deep Purple was a huge influence on a lot of these bands. So their inclusion here is good because it shows you that facet and that particular style that some new wave of British heavy metal bands did. All right, track 5, you've got Raven. Raven's one of those bands everyone has heard, but not everybody has checked out a ton of their catalog. But yes, they got their start in the new wave of British heavy metal. And, this was some of their best stuff. They were, very fast, very kind of wild, unhinged. And you get that here on the track, Don't Need Your Money. So again, this is one of those signpost bands that you ought to know a little bit about because other bands are going to get compared to them. And they've had such a long career that you can't help but run into other albums by them and stuff like that. Some later albums drifted away from this style quite a bit when they got onto a bigger label. But good to have them here for, again, Raven's a little unique in the new wave of British heavy metal with this fast, loose, almost slightly goofy sound at times. But yeah, a fantastic inclusion, a band people need to know. All right, track 6, you have a band called Parallax with a track entitled White Lightning. This is their first really deep cut on the compilation. Parallax did not go on to any kind of fame or fortune. They released, a 3-track, 12-inch EP. That was about it for the band. This is one that you're not going to stumble into in a whole lot of situations. It's a pretty solid track. Some people like it more than others. I've always thought it was a pretty cool track. It chugs along pretty good. Yes, the vocalist is kind of out of tune and a bit atonal, but it doesn't bother me that much. I still really like the song. And again, this starts to show you, there are bands besides the Ravens and the Saxons, bands that didn't go far, but may have made one or two really cool songs before they quickly disappeared into the ether. So I like that they included some of these on this compilation. It would be very easy to trim those kind of cuts off of this and just kind of make it into a, let's pick, 12 songs by 12 of the big bands and just feature those. It'd still probably be a very good compilation at that point. But extending the length of the compilation and including some of these really small time acts to show them off, let people see the variety that was out there, works really well. All right, moving right along. Track 7, we have Def Leppard with Get Your Rocks Off. Let's see, which version is this? This is from the original Def Leppard EP, highly collectible and very, very expensive, of course. This is Def Leppard when they really were a new wave of British heavy metal band. They, of course, drifted out of that scene very rapidly because they found a huge amount of commercial success very rapidly and started putting some distance between themselves and their former colleagues. Whatever you think of that attitude, this is a killer track, great guitar lines in it, good energy, really solid track. Again, is it as heavy or as, thrashy as a Sweet Savage? No, but it's also the kind of track I think that will catch some people off guard, be like, holy crap, that kicks ass a lot more than what I thought new wave of British heavy metal did. All right, after that, we have a band called Weapon with a song called Set the Stage Alight. This is one of the new wave of British heavy metal classic tunes. The band really didn't do a whole lot. They made one single, 12-inch and 7-inch versions, but kind of fell apart very quickly. But this was one of the early anthems that, again, it's a staple song that most folks are going to know. It's a very energetic one, very tight, good musicianship, good songwriting. It shows off what new wave of British heavy metal is capable of, that it wasn't just always a handful of teenage British kids hanging out and just barely able to play. This is really good stuff. All right, up next, track 9, we have the band Samson with a song called Vice Versa. Samson is most famous, of course, for helping launch the career of Bruce Dickinson before he signed on to Iron Maiden. Samson has a different style of new wave of British heavy metal, and frankly, not a band I've ever gotten into very much. I've had a couple of their albums, and they just never really do click with me. But here, I can appreciate their inclusion because it does show off. This song in particular, it's a little more laid back, kind of a pacey vibe to it. It's not as heavy, it's a little more airy. I'm not saying it's a terrible track. It's not something that I would want to have a whole bunch of. I have checked out the band, as I said, but they're not my style, but they might be a style that other people do enjoy. And it's, cool, if nothing else, to get a chance to hear what the band sounded like, because they do have that connection to the Iron Maiden family tree. And so you can hear Bruce back here when he was going by Bruce. He put a lot of thought into that stage name. And so you can hear him, before fame and fortune set in with Maiden. All right, track 10, you have one by a band called Hollow Ground. Now, on the back cover, this is misspelled. There's a typo where it's Hallow Ground, but the band is actually Hollow Ground. They have it correct here in the booklet. This is another very deep cut. This is a band that lasted a very short period of time. I think they were only around maybe a year or so. They had a couple of songs on a compilation album and one 7-inch EP that is a real bitch to find. I've made an entire video about my foibles trying to track down that EP over the years, that you can dig back through my older videos and check out the trials and tribulations that went into finding that thing. The Hollow Ground track, though, it's another excellent example of one of these deep cuts by an unknown band that absolutely blows people away. They had a very strong vocalist, really tight song. It's very energetic, very forceful. And so, it really opens your eyes to, man, this is a killer band. This was one of those songs that, the first time or two I heard that cassette tape back, around 1991, when I think I got it 91, maybe very, very dawn of 92, right away I knew I had to have more material by this band. I just didn't realize what a pain in the ass it was going to be to find more material by this band. So you can definitely get sent on some crazy rabbit chases with some of the tracks on here, but it's an excellent song. Next up, track 11, you've got Girl School with Demolition Boys. Girl School is another one of those just signpost bands that you should know what they sound like, and their sound is pretty straightforward. They've got a heavy Motorhead influence, but a little more catchy, a little more poppy, and it works brilliantly on their early material. This is a great song to feature the band, shows them off really well. Then last track from disc number 1 is by Witchfind. Now, not Witchfinder General. Every now and then you run into somebody who gets those two bands confused. They're two separate bands. The Witchfind track featured here is called Leaving Nadir, and it's one of the really few dud choices on this whole compilation. Now, Witchfind was an important band to a point back then. I have no problem with them including Witchfind on here. I just, for the life of me, don't know why they picked Leaving Nadir as the track they wanted to feature. Witchfind, on their first couple of albums, still had one foot firmly entrenched in the 70s rock scene. And this was a band that have roots going back to 1975 or so. In more recent years, some of those earliest Witchfind sessions have come to light. I've been able to check those out thanks to some of the viewers. Frank, appreciate it. And, but they also did have some heavier, more forceful songs. And so I'm always been at a loss as why they picked Leaving Nadir, because it's this very long song. I think it runs about 7 minutes. It's very slow and kind of lifeless. It's just not a real good showcase of what the band was capable of overall. So I can't explain that particular track. I would definitely have picked something like, Give 'em Hell or Moon Magic, something, that maybe shown little, put a positive spin on the band rather than having this really long, slow slog of a song. But yeah, out of 12 tracks on the first disc, that's the only one that I think was a bit of a misfire. All right, we're only halfway through. Actually, not even halfway if we count the bonus tracks, so let's keep going. On disc 2, you start off with Iron Maiden's Sanctuary. Iron Maiden, of course, is a band everyone's going to know before they ever start poking into new wave of British heavy metal. It's cool to have this song here because this was a BBC session recording. At the time this was put out, was previously unreleased. I'm sure it's available on other things by now, but yeah, it was cool to hear a different version of Sanctuary on here, and it's a very, very good take with Paul Di'Anno still singing, of course. Track number 2, we follow up with Jaguar's Backstreet Woman. Once again, you've got a track 2 on this disc is also a real barn burner ass kicker of a track. This is showing you how fast and how tight some of these new wave of British heavy metal bands could wind it up and really let it go. Fantastic track. Early Jaguars, some of the most aggressive stuff. And again, these are bands that were really laying the groundwork for the thrash and speed metal bands that would show up a little bit later in the 1980s. So great track there. Third, you've got Tigers of Pantang with Killers. This is another one of those staple bands that I think sometimes people overlook these. That when they get into new wave of British heavy metal, they want to gravitate towards what's the rarest thing, what's the craziest, most true cult underground, item no one's ever heard of. And some of those are really cool to check out. But you also have to know your basics. And Tigers of Pantang is one of the big staple bands from this scene. Very successful back in the day, multiple albums on MCA Records, got picked up very early, and did a lot of good music as well. Killers here is kind of a grindy, heavy song. So again, it's showing you this kind of nastier, grittier, dirty side of new wave of British heavy metal. Not all these bands are, singing clean or just doing dual, nice, clean guitar breaks. Yeah, this one's got, some sandpaper roughage going on to it, and it works really, really well. It's a great track to feature by Tigers. Track number 4 is by a band called Gaskin, entitled I'm No Fool. Fantastic song, a little more pacey, a little more atmospherics to the vocals, which work really, really well. Gaskin made a couple of albums back in the day. This is the version from the single, not the album, if I'm remembering right. There is a little difference, and the single version is the better one, in my opinion. But yeah, this again shows a different angle on new wave of British heavy metal bands, ones that were going for not a very laid back vibe, still kind of I just tend to call these atmospheric bands. They've got a little bit of an ambience to them, but it's not because they're just sitting back and playing very mellow music. It's just more in the delivery of it. Very cool band. All right, track 5, we have Sledgehammer doing a song called Sledgehammer. Sledgehammer have a little different style. They're maybe closer to the Samson camp. Never a band I got very much into. I've had 1 or 2 of their albums, heard other songs by them. Sledgehammer is probably their best song, so it was a good one to pick to show off the band. Just not a band that ever really clicked with me personally, but it's, again, showing off some variety in styles here. Track 6, we have the immortal Venom with Angel Dust. This is the version from Welcome to Hell. Great song to feature for Venom. Always a personal favorite. Always liked that tune. I kind of wish they had used the version from the Lead Weight compilation, but that was a more raw, kind of early take, I believe. So it makes sense that they would use the Welcome to Hell version instead. And of course, this is going to show off, the craziest extreme side of new wave of British heavy metal that you had. Yes, these bands that were, taking the Motorhead sound and, just slathering it in these over-the-top satanic lyrics and everything, so that, yeah, for folks that only want the more extreme metal, new wave of British heavy metal might not be for you, but there's always Venom and a few other cohorts. All right, following right on the heels of that, track 7 is by Angel Witch. It's Extermination Day. Great track from a compilation. And this is another one that is, again, setting the tone for thrash metal and speed metal to come. Angel Witch was a huge influence on Dave Mustaine. If you don't have Angel Witch, does Mustaine get involved in music and go on to Metallica and Megadeth and all that? I don't know for sure, but yeah, this was a band that made a huge impact on a lot of bands and a lot of musicians with their earliest releases. And it's another band that's operating at a very heavy. Extermination Day is a good track because it shows off just how heavy the band could be. So there's plenty of tracks on here to really help shatter that perception that new wave of British heavy metal is just a little too tired or dated sounding. After that, you get Trespass with One of These Days, fantastic song by a band that was successful early on. They made 3 7-inch items. It's another band that I think people overlook these days because their output has been known for a long time. The singles are not hard to track down whatsoever. They're not expensive. There's nothing cult about this band. But they did some fantastic songs. Great songwriting, great vocals, great guitar work. One of These Days is one of their best ones. So again, this is another band that's a little closer to that Gaskin style. So you can see another band that knew how, to inject, some moodiness, and some emotion and some atmosphere into it. After that, track 9 is Holocaust's Death or Glory. This is another rager. It has this crazy scream. It's got a very heavy, simple, jagged sounding riff to it. It's, all about somebody, pissed off, alienated, strange. There's a line in it, something like, only love my knife. Kind of, a little more disturbing, dark lyrics to it. Holocaust is another band that, if you poke around in new wave of British heavy metal very long, you'll get familiar with other releases they had too. Did a lot of cool stuff. It's a band I like. And this track is probably their heaviest. If not, it's definitely at the heaviest end of the spectrum for them. But I like its inclusion here to show off that more weighty side of the genre. All right, track 10 is Vardus, If I Were King. Now, Vardus operates in a very different vein in new wave of British heavy metal we haven't seen on here yet. They had a little bit more of the sort of boogie flavoring to their music. And I'm always of two minds of this style. On one hand, it does tend to be very fun. It's catchy. It's energetic. It rambles along very, very quickly. So it's a lot of fun to listen to. On the other hand, for me personally, it wears out its welcome very quickly. That, I play it a few times and then I just don't want to hear it again for quite a while afterwards. But Boris was very good at this style. It's, again, a band that you see mentioned a lot in new wave of British heavy metal circles. If you want something to check out by Vardus, I'd recommend actually the live album, 100 Miles Per Hour. It shows, the band at their finest. Usually you don't think of live albums as being, the best thing necessarily to check out a band with. But in this case, that's an excellent Vardus release if you like this particular style of new wave of British heavy metal. All right, track 11, we have Blitzkrieg with the song Blitzkrieg. Best known, of course, for getting covered by Metallica later on. It's another very heavy song, very weighty tune. It's one of the classics. It's an anthem for the entire genre. Can't really go wrong with it. It's a song that you should know and learn early on if you're going to be interested in new wave of British heavy metal, and even if you're not, simply for the Metallica connections. All right, then track 12 on disc 2 is another Diamond Head song. So Lars and Brian, being huge Diamond Head fans, decided they would bookend the compilation with 2 Diamond Head tracks, and they wrap it up here with Helpless, which is another excellent choice for a song. They didn't pick any of the really super long, super slower tracks, like Sucking My Love or stuff. I'm a little surprised they didn't pick Lightning to the Nations for one of them, but that's okay. Both It's Electric and Helpless are fantastic songs. And if you were going to put 2 songs by any band on here, Diamond Head is a very appropriate choice. All right, so what about those CD bonus tracks? Now, I do not know if the bonus tracks are on the vinyl or not. I would guess not, because 30 tracks would be a ton to pile onto just 2 pieces of vinyl. So they may only be on the CD. They definitely were not on the cassette tape. That was one of the reasons when I found it on CD and saw extra tracks, I was like, oh, I must get this right away. And I'm glad I did, because they have some amazing tracks here in the 6 bonus cuts. The first one is by a band called Dragster with the song Ambitions. I've featured clips of this in a previous video, so you can go back and check those out if you want to. Great tune, very catchy, high energy, love the song. This is another kind of deep cut. This band did not do a whole lot. They made the single, they had 1, maybe 2 compilation appearances, recorded some more stuff later, but didn't really see the light of day. So Great track here. After that, you've got A to Z with a track called Treason, which is another really strong, forceful, high energy one. It's not a thrashy song or anything like that, but yeah, it's up tempo. It'll get you banging your head. It'll get you cranking it louder. A to Z had just a little tiny sliver of success. They kind of got hired to a big label. I think it was Polydor, but the label seemed to have gotten cold feet. They only did like a 12-inch EP and a live album. And that live album is not the place to start. The Witch of Berkeley live album by A to Z, the sound quality is really flat on it, for one thing. And it just doesn't seem to show the case the band at their finest. I don't know if it's just the track list or maybe it wasn't their strongest performance. But for whatever reasons, it was always a little disappointing on that album. But Treason's a great track to feature here. Killer guitars on it. This is a track you can dig. Third of the 6 bonus tracks is Witchfinder General's self-titled track, Witchfinder General. And this one blew me away the first time I heard this compilation, because here was a band operating much more in the doomy Black Sabbath tradition, which isn't something very many new wave of British heavy metal bands did. And I think, for a lot of those bands, they obviously were into Sabbath. They knew the Sabbath albums, but they were trying to do something, that was a lot more, forceful, energetic, more lively. They were, trying to move away from some of that, 70s heavy metal sound. But Witchfinder General kind of revels in it, and they do it so well. This is a killer track. This was another one that as soon as I heard it, just like, I must find more stuff by this band. And they did a couple of albums. They had a single. They had an EP. So yeah, there's Witchfinder General material out there. Today, the band is, highly regarded as one of these sort of forefathers of the whole doom metal scene. At the time, they were not a particularly big band. They didn't play live a whole lot. They tended to get some pretty lukewarm reviews. A lot of people thought, the covers with always having, half-naked women, being, accosted by Witchfinder generals. A lot of people thought that was just too corny, too cheesy, too much of a ha ha ha, put boobs on the cover and you think we'll buy it. And people weren't really taking the bait, so to speak. But musically, fantastic band. One of my favorites. I own, well, let's just say I own a couple of copies of each of their albums and leave it at that for today. All right, track number 4 among the bonus tracks is Black Axe with the excellent Red Lights. Here's another band that's cranking up the speed a little bit, not going crazy, but a really driving, forceful number, well put together. Black Axe is one of the big misses from the new wave of British heavy metal. There's a band that clearly had the songwriting capabilities to have gotten bigger and had more attention. And, they had a name change. There were delays ever getting a record deal. And by the time they got something out, it was a little too late. Their one full-length album may have actually even come out after the band had already split up. I don't remember off the top of my head. But nevertheless, it's a killer song. The single's never been that hard to find, although I think it has crept up in price over the years. But yeah, this is the sort of classic style of new wave of British heavy metal done at its finest. You don't get much better than Black Axe and Red Lights. Track number 5 is a band called Fist with a song entitled SS Gyro. I don't like this song. I just don't. Fist, put out some different products at the time. They had 1 or 2 albums, a single. They've just never clicked with me. They're maybe a little bit more in the Sledgehammer direction. Some of the songs here there aren't bad. SS Gyro is not a terrible song at all. I'm probably harshing on it more than I should. But yeah, I said earlier, on disc 1, I would have definitely picked a different song by Witchfind. Here among the bonus tracks, I don't know if I would have picked Fist. I might have tried to have dug up something else. It probably doesn't help that I also ended up with 1 or 2 other compilations early on that had this exact same Fist song on it. So it seems like this was always the song that was getting featured by Fist. And I just kind of got sick of it very quickly because it's like, why do they keep playing this one song? It's not that amazing that it needs to be featured on every compilation. Anyway, we wrap up the bonus tracks with Praying Mantis and their song Captured City. Praying Mantis was another band that had a fair amount of success early on. This was a band that, stuck more to maybe the hard rocking side of new wave of British heavy metal and definitely needed an inclusion here. Frankly, I'm surprised they weren't in the main 24 tracks someplace. But as we've seen, it was a pretty stacked track list overall. Kind of hard to find room to wiggle others in. And of course, there's all kinds of other great tracks that you could include. So yeah, if you're looking for a place to really get a good feel for a cross section of new wave of British heavy metal bands, this would be an excellent place to do it. For one reasonable price, you're going to hear 29 different bands operating in very different corners or different sectors of the new wave of British heavy metal soundscape. You're going to hear some of the key bands that you ought to be at least passingly familiar with. You're going to hear a few deep cuts by some great bands, so that if you want to start bulking up your want list with obscure items, this will point the way for you. Absolutely. And it's a great package and a great place to start your new wave of British heavy metal journey. All right, let's wrap this thing up. So let's talk metal in the comments down below. Do you think there's a different compilation album that you would recommend people start out if they want to check into new wave of British heavy metal? There are lots and lots of good compilations. One of the big reasons I picked this one myself is just the sheer volume of tracks you get. But other compilations, have a great lineup as well. If someone came up to you tomorrow and was like, hey, I want to check out what new wave of British heavy metal is about, what should I listen to? What would you recommend that person use to start their journey into this style? Leave a comment down below. Let me know what you think. All right. With that, let's wrap it all up. Until next time, everybody take care. And as always, keep banging your head.